Sometimes the biggest secrets don't arrive with a confession. Sometimes they show up at your front door carrying a single suitcase. I always believed I knew Noah Brooks better than anyone else in the world. We had been best friends since we were 18, survived impossible deadlines in college, celebrated every promotion, every birthday, every tiny victory that adulthood reluctantly handed us. We weren't the kind of friends who needed to text every hour or call every night. We simply existed in each other's lives like gravity, constant and dependable. That was why, when my phone buzzed at 8:14 on a rainy Sunday evening, I answered without hesitation. His voice sounded strangely distant. "Hey, Ethan, can I stay with you for a week?" There was no joke waiting at the end of the sentence. No sarcastic comment. Just silence. I looked out the window of my small apartment in Portland, watching rain slide down the glass. "Of course," I answered. "You don't even have to ask." He thanked me so quietly, I almost didn't hear it before the line went dead. 45 minutes later, someone knocked on my apartment door. Noah stood there beneath the hallway light, wearing a dark jacket, soaked from the rain. Water dripped from his hair onto the old wooden floor as soon as I opened the door. Beside him rested a worn black suitcase, the same one he had carried on our graduation trip years ago. It looked older somehow, just like he did. Noah had always been the calm one, the guy who smiled even during disasters and somehow convinced everyone everything would work out. Tonight that smile was gone. The circles beneath his blue eyes looked deeper than exhaustion. They looked permanent. "You look terrible," I said before I could stop myself. A tiny laugh escaped him. "Thanks. Missed you too." It sounded rehearsed, as though he remembered how laughter was supposed to work but had forgotten how it felt. I stepped aside, letting him in. The familiar scent of rain, coffee, and cedar followed him into the apartment. He placed the suitcase carefully beside my couch instead of carrying it toward the guest room. His eyes wandered slowly around the apartment, lingering on the framed sketches hanging above my desk, the old record player we had found at a garage sale, the coffee mug with a cracked handle that he had accidentally dropped 3 Christmases ago. He studied everything with unusual patience, almost as if he were trying to memorize the room. "You haven't changed much," he murmured. "Neither have you," I replied automatically, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew they weren't true. Something inside him had shifted. During dinner, he barely touched his grilled cheese sandwich. He complimented my tomato soup, even though I had obviously burned it. He asked about my freelance illustration projects, remembered the names of clients I had mentioned months earlier, and smiled politely at every story I told. But every few minutes his attention drifted somewhere I couldn't follow. Once, I caught him staring out the window with an expression so heavy it made the room feel colder. Around midnight, after I showed him the guest room, I walked toward the kitchen for a glass of water. As I passed the hallway, I noticed his bedroom door wasn't fully closed. Through the narrow opening, I saw him sitting alone on the edge of the bed, holding an old photograph of the two of us from college. He wasn't crying. He wasn't smiling. He was simply looking at it like someone trying to remember a life that already belonged to someone else. That was the moment I realized Noah hadn't come here because he needed a place to sleep. He had come because 1 week from now, everything between us was going to change. The next morning began with the familiar smell of freshly brewed coffee drifting through my apartment, and for one brief moment, everything felt wonderfully ordinary again. I found Noah standing by the kitchen window wearing one of my old hoodies, his damp hair finally dry, his hands wrapped around a mug as he watched the sleepy Portland streets come alive beneath a gray sky. It reminded me of our college mornings, when we used to split rent on a tiny apartment with unreliable heating and celebrate surviving another week with cheap coffee and burnt toast. "You still make coffee that could wake the entire neighborhood," Noah said with the faintest hint of the old smile I remembered. "You still drink it anyway," I answered. He nodded once, almost grateful for the normal conversation. We spent the morning wandering through the neighborhood farmer's market like we had done countless times before. Noah insisted on buying fresh apples, even though neither of us really needed them. He stopped to listen to a street musician playing an acoustic guitar, dropped a few dollars into the open case, and thanked the performer with unusual sincerity. I noticed he seemed to appreciate every tiny moment as though each one carried more weight than it should. At lunch, we ordered sandwiches from the corner deli that had somehow survived every economic downturn over the past decade. The owner recognized us immediately. "The troublemakers are back," she laughed. Noah laughed too, but there was something bittersweet hidden behind it. On the walk home, he asked questions that caught me off guard. Did I still enjoy illustrating children's books? Was I happy living alone? Did I ever regret staying in Portland instead of moving to New York like I had once dreamed? They were not casual questions. They sounded like someone quietly taking inventory of another person's life. That evening, we cooked dinner together, bumping into each other in my small kitchen exactly the way we always had. Noah chopped vegetables while I handled the pasta, and for nearly an hour, it almost felt as though nothing had changed. Then his phone vibrated across the countertop. The screen lit up with an incoming call. I was not trying to read it, but one word caught my eye before he quickly turned the phone face down. Unknown. He stared at it without answering until the ringing stopped. A minute later, another notification appeared. He silenced that one too. Everything okay? I asked carefully. Just work, he replied too quickly. I took some time off, but apparently nobody knows how to leave me alone. He forced a smile that disappeared almost immediately. Later that night, we settled onto the couch with an old adventure movie we had watched dozens of times before. Normally, Noah quoted every memorable line before the actors could say it. Tonight, he barely followed the story. Halfway through the film, I noticed he was not watching the television at all. His attention remained fixed on the rain tapping softly against the balcony door. Do you remember what you told me after graduation? He suddenly asked. I frowned, trying to think back. Probably something embarrassing. He shook his head. You said that no matter where life took us, we would always have one place that felt like home, because home could be a person, not just a building. I smiled. That sounds surprisingly wise for 22-year-old me. Noah looked down at his hands. You were right. Before I could ask what he meant, he stood, wished me good night, and disappeared into the guest room. A few minutes later, while carrying my empty mug to the sink, I noticed something resting on the coffee table where he had been sitting. It was a folded envelope with no stamp, no address, and only one word written across the front in careful handwriting. Ethan. I stared at the envelope for several long seconds without touching it. The handwriting was unmistakably Noah's, steady and familiar. The same handwriting that had filled birthday cards, grocery lists, and countless postcards over the years. If he had wanted me to read it, why had he left it behind without saying a word? I picked it up, feeling the weight of the folded paper inside, but something stopped me. It felt private, almost sacred. When Noah walked into the kitchen the next morning, he noticed the envelope in my hand before I could say anything. His expression changed instantly. You found it, he said quietly. I was going to give it to you later. I held it out toward him. Then keep it until you are ready. For the first time since he arrived, genuine surprise crossed his face. He accepted the envelope carefully and slipped it into the pocket of his jacket without opening it. Thank you, he whispered. The rest of the morning passed in an uneasy calm. Noah offered to help organize my studio, insisting that my shelves had become a disaster. We sorted sketchbooks, old paintbrushes, and stacks of illustrations that had never been published. Every object seemed to unlock another memory. We laughed about terrible student projects and impossible professors, but every laugh ended a little too quickly. Around lunchtime, Noah volunteered to pick up groceries while I stayed behind to finish a deadline for one of my clients. Nearly an hour passed before I realized he had forgotten his tablet on the dining table. It vibrated once. Then again. The screen lit up with a calendar reminder. Appointment. Thursday, 9 o'clock in the morning. St. Matthew Medical Center. The notification disappeared before I could read anything else. My stomach tightened. Noah had never mentioned any appointment. He returned a few minutes later carrying 2 grocery bags and smiling as though nothing had happened. I almost asked him about the hospital, but something in his tired eyes convinced me to stay silent. That evening, the rain finally stopped, leaving the sidewalks shining beneath the streetlights. We decided to take a walk through the neighborhood park. Families were packing up picnics while children chased each other across the grass. Noah watched them with an expression I could not quite understand. Do you ever wonder how different life could have been? He asked. Every now and then, I admitted. But I usually end up appreciating the path I actually took. He nodded slowly without looking at me. I wish I had your confidence. As we continued walking, his phone rang again. This time he stepped several yards away before answering. I could not hear every word, only fragments carried by the evening breeze. No, not yet. I need a little more time. Please. His voice sounded strained but calm. When he returned, he slipped the phone into his pocket before I could pretend not to notice. Everything still work? I asked with a smile that felt increasingly difficult to maintain. He hesitated just long enough for the silence to become uncomfortable. Something like that. Later that night, after Noah had gone to bed, I carried a blanket to the living room because sleep refused to come. As I reached for the television remote, I noticed a folded piece of paper sticking halfway out of the side pocket of his suitcase. I had no intention of invading his privacy, but a sudden draft from the open window pulled the paper onto the floor. Instinctively, I picked it up. Before I could look away, one line printed across the top caught my attention. Patient consultation summary. St. Matthew Medical Center. The paper slipped from my fingers almost as quickly as I had picked it up. I stared at it for a heartbeat before carefully placing it back where it had fallen. I had seen only the heading, nothing more, and I intended to keep it that way. Noah deserved his privacy, even if every instinct inside me was screaming that something was terribly wrong. I closed the suitcase pocket as gently as I could and stepped away, but sleep never came. Instead, I lay awake listening to the faint sound of rainwater dripping from the balcony outside, wondering why my best friend looked at ordinary moments as though he were quietly saying goodbye to them. The next morning, I found an old cardboard box while searching the closet for extra blankets. Across the front, written in thick black marker, were 3 simple words. College stuff. I carried it into the living room and laughed to myself before opening it. Inside were ticket stubs from concerts we could barely afford, faded photographs, worn notebooks, and a ridiculous plastic trophy we had won during freshman orientation after somehow finishing last in a campus scavenger hunt. Noah wandered into the room carrying 2 mugs of coffee and immediately smiled when he saw the mess covering the floor. I forgot we still had all of that, he said, kneeling beside me. For the first time since his arrival, the heaviness around him seemed to lift. We spent the next hour traveling backward through our own history. There was the photo from our first apartment, where the ceiling leaked every time it rained and we lined pots across the kitchen floor to catch the water. Another picture showed us standing outside the university library at 2 o'clock in the morning after finishing final exams, exhausted but convinced we had somehow figured out life. Then I found a folded receipt tucked inside one of my old sketchbooks. 2 grilled cheese sandwiches and 1 tomato soup. $8.43. Noah laughed so hard he nearly spilled his coffee. You insisted that was the greatest meal in America, he said. It was, I replied. I was broke. You are still broke. Freelance artists call it financially unpredictable. His laughter sounded real this time, warm enough to erase years from his face. As the afternoon sunlight filtered through the windows, I discovered an old notebook filled with quick pencil sketches. Most of them were random people on campus, professors, classmates, strangers sitting in coffee shops. Nearly every 3rd page, however, contained another drawing of Noah, reading on the library steps, sleeping during lectures, drinking coffee by the river, looking toward the sunset from the roof of our apartment building. I had never noticed how often I had drawn him until that moment. Noah quietly turned the pages beside me. You always notice details that everyone else missed, he whispered. I just like practicing portraits, I answered, suddenly embarrassed. He looked at me for a long moment before smiling gently. Maybe. We continued sorting through the box until a folded campus map slipped onto the carpet. A small red circle marked a quiet overlook above the river outside town. Every Friday evening during college we walked there after classes, bringing cheap takeout and talking until the stars appeared. Do you want to go back? I asked without thinking. Noah looked at the map as though it belonged to another lifetime. His fingers rested lightly against the faded paper before he nodded. Yes, he said softly. There is something about that place I have needed to remember for a very long time. The drive to the overlook took a little less than 40 minutes, but it felt as though we were traveling much farther than that. Every familiar street seemed to pull another memory to the surface. Noah pointed out the old bookstore where we had spent rainy Saturdays pretending we could afford every novel on the shelves. I laughed when we passed the diner that used to give us free pie after midnight because the owner believed 2 exhausted college students deserved something sweet after finals. For a little while, the conversation flowed naturally again, light and effortless, almost convincing me that the strange distance between us had only been my imagination. When we reached the overlook, the view had not changed at all. The river stretched across the valley, reflecting the afternoon sunlight like polished glass. while tall pine trees swayed gently in the summer breeze. We carried takeout sandwiches to our favorite weathered bench, the same one where we had once spent nearly every Friday evening talking about careers, dreams, and the impossible certainty that life would always make sense if we faced it together. Noah stood quietly before sitting down, letting his eyes wander across the landscape. "It is exactly the way I remembered it," he said softly. "Some places refuse to change." I smiled. "Unlike people." He glanced toward me, but did not answer. We ate in comfortable silence for several minutes before Noah reached into his backpack and handed me a small paper bag. "Open it." Inside was a brand new sketchbook with thick cream-colored pages. I ran my fingers across the cover, surprised. "You bought this for me?" He nodded. "You have filled every sketchbook since college. I figured you would need another one soon." "You remembered the brand." "I remember more than you think." His words lingered between us long after the conversation faded. Before leaving the overlook, I opened the first page and quickly sketched the river, the bench, and the outline of Noah standing near the railing with the wind moving gently through his hair. He watched without saying a word. When I finished, he smiled with quiet satisfaction. "Now this place cannot disappear," he said. On the drive home, however, the atmosphere shifted again. Noah became unusually quiet, staring out the passenger window as though counting the passing miles. When we reached my apartment, he excused himself almost immediately, saying he needed to take care of something. He disappeared into the guest room and closed the door. A few moments later, I heard his voice through the wall, low and controlled, speaking to someone on the phone. I could not make out every sentence, only scattered pieces. "Yes, tomorrow morning." "I understand." "No, he still does not know." My heart sank. He still does not know. The words echoed in my mind long after the conversation ended. The following day, Noah left before sunrise, claiming he wanted to grab coffee from a cafe across town. Hours passed without a message. I tried distracting myself with illustration work, but my attention never stayed on the screen for more than a few minutes. Around noon, I stepped onto the balcony and happened to notice his jacket hanging over the back of a chair. A folded receipt peeked from the pocket. I hesitated before pulling it free, intending only to return it later. The receipt was from St. Matthew Medical Center, dated the previous afternoon, several hours before our trip to the Overlook. Attached to it with a small paperclip was a visitor badge that had never been used. Across the top, beneath Noah Brooks's name, one sentence stood out with quiet finality. "Follow-up appointment confirmed for tomorrow at 9 o'clock in the morning." The next morning I woke before my alarm, unable to shake the feeling that the day had been quietly approaching since Noah first appeared at my door with that single worn suitcase. His room was already empty. The bed was neatly made, the blankets folded with the same careful precision he always used, and a handwritten note rested on the pillow. It simply read, "I will be back this afternoon. Please do not worry." As if 4 words could erase an entire week of unanswered questions. I poured myself a cup of coffee, but it had already gone cold before I took the first sip. Every glance around the apartment reminded me of him. His favorite mug sat drying beside the sink. The new sketchbook he had given me rested on my desk. The apples he insisted on buying were still sitting untouched in the fruit bowl. It felt as though Noah had quietly woven himself back into my daily routine, making the thought of losing that routine impossible to ignore. By 11 o'clock, I could no longer focus on work. I closed my laptop and walked aimlessly through the apartment until I noticed the envelope again, the one with my name written across the front. It was still tucked inside the pocket of Noah's jacket hanging near the door. I stared at it for several long moments before stepping away. Whatever was inside belonged to Noah until he chose otherwise. I refused to become the kind of friend who learned the truth by stealing it. Early that afternoon, the front door finally opened. Noah stepped inside, carrying 2 paper cups of coffee from the little cafe 3 blocks away, smiling as though the morning had been perfectly ordinary. "I figured you were probably working too hard," he said, handing 1 cup to me. I accepted it, but did not drink. "How did your appointment go?" The smile disappeared almost instantly. He froze without answering, his eyes settling on the coffee in his hands. "You knew?" he asked quietly. "I saw the hospital receipt by accident. I was not looking for it." He nodded slowly, more disappointed than angry. "I should have guessed." The silence between us stretched until it became impossible to ignore. Finally, I looked directly at him. "Noah, I am not asking because I am curious. I am asking because you are my best friend, and I have spent an entire week watching you carry something alone." He lowered himself onto the couch without touching the coffee. His shoulders seemed heavier than they had only days before. "I kept telling myself I would explain everything tomorrow," he said. Then tomorrow kept becoming another tomorrow. I sat across from him, giving him all the space he needed. "You do not have to protect me from the truth." He let out a slow breath and rubbed his hands together nervously. "That is exactly what I have been trying to do." For several seconds, he looked toward the window, watching clouds drift across the afternoon sky. His eyes grew damp, though he fought hard to keep his composure. "Ethan," he whispered, "have you ever cared about someone so much that telling them the truth felt more frightening than keeping it hidden?" I answered without hesitation. "Yes, but hiding it usually hurts both people." He closed his eyes, absorbing the words as though he had already known them. When he opened them again, there was a quiet acceptance I had not seen before. He reached into his jacket pocket, slowly removed the envelope with my name written across the front, and placed it gently on the coffee table between us. Then he looked at me with a sadness that made my chest tighten. "I think," he said softly, "it is finally time for you to read this." My hands rested on the envelope for several seconds before I finally broke the seal. The paper inside had been folded so many times that the creases had nearly worn through. I recognized Noah's handwriting immediately, careful and steady, yet somehow more vulnerable than I had ever seen it. The first sentence stopped me before I could continue. "If you are reading this, it means I finally found the courage to stop hiding from the person who has always mattered most." I swallowed hard and kept reading. He wrote about our first day of college, when we had accidentally reached for the same campus map outside the student center and ended up laughing over our terrible sense of direction. He remembered details I had completely forgotten, like the faded blue backpack I carried for 3 years and the ridiculous Lucky baseball cap I refused to throw away because I believed it helped me pass exams. He wrote about every late-night conversation, every road trip, every birthday, every ordinary afternoon that had quietly become extraordinary simply because we had shared it together. Then the letter changed. Somewhere along the way, my friendship became something deeper. I tried to ignore it because I never wanted to risk losing the best thing that had ever happened to me. I convinced myself that if I stayed close enough, that would be enough. For years, I believed silence was the safest way to love someone. My eyes blurred as I reached the next page. Noah continued by explaining why he had suddenly asked to stay with me. Several weeks earlier, during a routine medical checkup, doctors had discovered a heart condition that required specialized treatment and careful monitoring. The appointment at St. Matthew Medical Center had been the beginning of that process, not the end. His prognosis was encouraging, and his physicians expected a full recovery with proper care, but hearing the diagnosis had forced him to confront every conversation he had postponed and every feeling he had buried. He realized that life could change without warning, and he no longer wanted fear to decide what remained unsaid. "I did not come here because I expected anything from you," he wrote. "I came because I wanted 1 week where I could simply be with my favorite person before I finally told the truth. If you cannot return my feelings, nothing about your kindness will ever become a mistake. You have already given me more friendship than most people find in a lifetime." My hands trembled as I lowered the letter. The apartment was completely silent except for the soft ticking of the kitchen clock. Across the coffee table, Noah sat with his eyes lowered, giving me all the time I needed. "The doctors believe I am going to be okay," he said quietly before I could speak. "I should have told you that first. I never wanted you to think this was a goodbye. It is not. I was just terrified that if I told you everything at once, I would lose my best friend before I even had the chance to be honest." I looked at him, really looked at him, and suddenly every strange moment from the past week settled into place. The careful way he memorized every room in my apartment. The questions about whether I was happy. The gifts, the photographs, the overlook above the river, the envelope that had waited patiently until he was ready. None of it had been random. It had all been leading here. Noah finally met my eyes, and with a nervous smile that barely reached his face, he whispered the words he had carried alone for years. "Ethan, I have loved you for a very long time, and no matter what your answer is, I could not spend another day pretending that I did not." For a long time, neither of us spoke. The silence did not feel uncomfortable. It felt fragile, as though one careless word might shatter everything we had spent more than 10 years building together. I looked down at the letter again, reading the first few lines for a second time, and suddenly dozens of forgotten memories returned with startling clarity. I remembered the night I caught the flu during our sophomore year, and Noah slept on the floor beside my bed because he refused to leave me alone. I remembered every apartment I had moved into, where he was always the first person carrying boxes through the front door. I remembered every birthday when he somehow knew exactly what would make me smile, every difficult phone call when his voice was the one that convinced me I could keep going. None of those memories had changed. Only my understanding of them had. I slowly realized that while Noah had been quietly protecting his feelings, I had been accepting his devotion as something ordinary simply because it had always been there. Why did I never see it? I asked more to myself than to him. Noah gave a small shrug and smiled gently. Because I worked very hard to make sure you did not. I never wanted you to feel guilty for something you never asked for. His answer hurt more than I expected. I stood and walked toward the balcony, needing a moment to breathe. The afternoon sky had begun to clear, and sunlight reflected across the wet rooftops after another brief Portland shower. I thought about the past week. The careful way Noah looked around my apartment when he first arrived. The sketchbook he bought for me. The trip back to our favorite overlook. The questions about whether I was happy. None of those moments had been attempts to persuade me. They had been gifts. Quiet moments he wanted to remember, regardless of how this conversation ended. I finally understood why he had looked at everything with such gratitude. He was not preparing to leave my life. He was preparing himself to stop hiding inside it. I turned back toward him. Noah was still sitting exactly where I had left him, his hands folded together as though he had already accepted whatever answer was coming. It occurred to me that the bravest thing he had done was not confess his feelings. The bravest thing was giving me complete freedom to answer honestly. There had been no pressure, no expectations, only trust. I walked back into the living room and sat beside him instead of across from him. He looked surprised but remained silent. You asked me a question without actually asking it, I said softly. So I think you deserve an honest answer. I paused, searching for words that felt worthy of the moment. I have spent this entire week wondering why everything suddenly felt different. The truth is, nothing changed this week. What changed was me. I finally stopped looking at our story as something ordinary. Noah's eyes filled with cautious hope, but he still did not interrupt. I smiled through the emotion building in my chest. I cannot tell you that I understood my feelings years ago, because I did not. But I can tell you this. The thought of you walking out that front door and becoming only a memory scared me more than anything I have ever imagined. That is not how friendship feels. At least, not for me anymore. A quiet laugh escaped Noah before he quickly wiped away a tear. I reached over and gently placed my hand over his. Whatever comes next, we will figure it out together. Your treatment, your recovery, every confusing conversation, every ordinary morning with terrible coffee. I do not want you carrying any of it alone again. For the first time since he had arrived with that single suitcase, the weight he had been carrying seemed to lift, and his smile finally looked exactly like the one I remembered from the very first day we met. 1 year later, the apartment looked almost exactly the same, but somehow it felt entirely different. The framed sketches still covered the walls. The old record player still sat in the corner beside the bookshelf. The cracked coffee mug Noah had accidentally chipped years ago was still waiting beside the sink because neither of us could bring ourselves to replace it. Some things, I had learned, deserved to stay imperfect because they carried too many memories to throw away. Outside, another gentle Portland rain tapped against the windows, the same quiet rhythm that had welcomed Noah through my front door a year earlier. This time, however, he was already home. Coffee is ready, he called from the kitchen. I smiled as I closed my sketchbook and walked toward the familiar voice that had become the soundtrack of my everyday life. His medical treatment had gone exactly as his doctors hoped. There had been appointments, long conversations, moments of uncertainty, and days when patience was harder than optimism, but each small step carried us forward. We celebrated every encouraging report with breakfast at our favorite diner and every milestone with another visit to the overlook above the river. Somewhere along the way, those traditions stopped feeling like celebrations and simply became part of our life together. Noah handed me a steaming mug before leaning comfortably against the counter. You are smiling again, he said. Was I not smiling yesterday? I asked. He laughed. You were. I just like noticing. That simple sentence reminded me of everything I had failed to notice for so many years. Love had never arrived in one dramatic moment. It had been quietly waiting inside ordinary days, hidden in shared meals, late-night phone calls, long drives, forgotten photographs, and the steady presence of someone who never stopped choosing to stay. I had spent years searching for extraordinary signs without realizing that the greatest love story of my life had been unfolding inside the smallest moments. Later that afternoon, we drove back to the Overlook, carrying sandwiches from the same little deli and coffee from the same neighborhood cafe. The weathered bench was still there, facing the river exactly as it always had. I opened the sketchbook Noah had given me the year before and flipped past dozens of drawings created over the previous 12 months. There were sketches of rainy mornings, hospital waiting rooms transformed by hopeful smiles, weekend farmers markets, quiet evenings reading together, and countless ordinary moments that no longer seemed ordinary at all. The final blank page waited patiently at the end. Your turn, I said, handing Noah the pencil. He looked genuinely surprised. I cannot draw. Neither could I when I started. He laughed softly before accepting the pencil anyway. Several minutes later, he handed the sketchbook back with an embarrassed smile. His drawing was wonderfully imperfect, little more than two stick figures sitting on a bench beneath a crooked tree, but above them, he had carefully written one sentence. Home was never a place. It was always you. I looked at the words until they became difficult to see through the tears gathering in my eyes. Without saying anything else, I closed the sketchbook and held it carefully against my chest. The river continued flowing below us, carrying another season toward the future, while the wind moved gently through the pine trees exactly as it had the first time we stood there together years before. Life had not become perfect. It had simply become honest. Looking back now, I realized the greatest gift Noah ever gave me was not his confession. It was the courage to tell the truth before another ordinary day slipped away, because sometimes forever begins the moment two people stop pretending they are only friends.